20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Chapter 8. Mobilis in Mobile. This movement, though so roughly executed, was performed with lightning rapidity. My companions and I had not time to look about us. I do not know that it was a great trial, our being thus introduced to the floating prison, but for my own part I must say that a rapid shudder went through me. With whom had we to do? Doubtless with some pirates, who were exploring the seas after their own fashion. Scarcely had the narrow panel been closed than we were surrounded by thick darkness. My eyes, coming from the daylight so suddenly, could distinguish nothing. I felt that I was upon an iron ladder. Ned Land and Conseil, held tightly, followed me. At the bottom of the ladder a door was opened and was shut upon us with a loud noise. We were left to ourselves. Where? I could not say, scarcely fancy. All around us was such an absolute blackness that even after a time my eyes perceived none of those rays which are perceptible in the darkest nights. Ned Land, furious at such treatment, gave free vent to his indignation. "1,000 devils!" he cried. "They call this hospitality. They only want to be cannibals to be perfect. I should not be surprised, but I will give them something before they make a meal of me." "Be quiet, friend Ned. Keep quiet," said Conseil calmly. "Don't look too far ahead. We are not roasted yet." "Roasted, no," replied Land, "but we are in the oven. It is as dark at any rate. Fortunately, I have not lost my bowie knife, and I can generally see well enough to use it. The very first of these robbers who lays a finger on me—" "Don't put yourself out, Ned," I said. "We shall gain nothing by useless violence. Who can tell whether they can hear us? Let us rather endeavour to ascertain where we are." I advanced with outstretched hands. After 5 paces, I touched a wall of riveted iron plates. Returning, I ran against a wooden table, near which were some stools. The floor was covered with a thick matting, which deadened the sound of our footsteps. The bare walls had neither door nor window perceptible. Conseil, who had been making a tour in the opposite direction, rejoined me, and we came into the centre of this cabin, which appeared to be about 20 feet long and 10 wide. Even Ned Land, with his great height to assist him, could not touch the ceiling. After half an hour had passed in this way, our eyes were suddenly exposed to a violently brilliant light. Our prison was suddenly illuminated. In the whiteness and intensity of this gleam, I recognized the electric light which produced the appearance of a magnificent phosphorescence around the submarine vessel. I was involuntarily obliged to close my eyes, and when I again opened them, I found that the light had been placed in a ground-glass globe, which was fixed at the upper end of the cabin. "At last we can see something," cried Ned Land, who, bowie knife in hand, stood on the defensive. "Yes," I replied, risking the antithesis, "but the situation is not the less obscure." "If monsieur will only have patience," said the impassible Conseil. The sudden illumination of the cabin gave me the opportunity to examine it more minutely. It only contained a table and 5 stools. The invisible door was hermetically closed. No sound reached our ears. Everyone seemed dead on board. Whether it was still moving over the surface of the ocean or plunged in its depths, I could not divine. However, the lamp had not been lighted for nothing, so I was in hopes that the crew of the vessel would soon put in an appearance. When people wish to put an end to prisoners, they do not illuminate the oubliettes. I was not mistaken. The noise of withdrawing bolts was heard, the door opened, and 2 men entered. One was rather short, but strongly made, with immense breadth of shoulder, intellectual looking, with thick black hair and beard, piercing eyes, and with the vivacity which characterizes the provincial population of France. Diderot has justly maintained that man's gesture is metaphorical, and this little man was the living proof of that statement. One had a sort of feeling that his habitual discourse was made up of prosopopoeia, metonymus, and hypologies, but I was not able to verify this, as he always used a peculiar and utterly incomprehensible idiom. The second arrival deserves a more detailed description. A pupil of Gratiolet or Engel would have read his face like a book. I can easily recall his characteristics. confidence in himself, for his head rose nobly from the arc formed by the line of his shoulders, and his dark eyes regarded you with a cool assurance. He was composed, for his face, more pale than ruddy, betokened a dispassionate nature. Energy he possessed, as demonstrated by the rapid contraction of the eyebrows. Finally, he was courageous, for his deep breathing denoted great vitality. I should add that this man was proud. His firm and composed look seemed to reflect elevated thoughts, and, added to all this, the homogeneity of expression in the movements of his body and face, according to the observation of physiognomists, resulted in an indisputable open-heartedness. I felt myself involuntarily reassured in his presence, and I augured well of our interview. This person might have been any age between 35 and 50. He was tall, a wide forehead, straight nose, a well-shaped mouth, beautiful teeth, long, thin, and very muscular hands, worthy to serve an elevated and passionate mind. This was certainly the most admirable type of individual that I have ever seen. To descend to detail, his eyes, set a little apart, could embrace nearly a quarter of the horizon. This faculty, which came to my knowledge later, gave him a great advantage over the excellent sight of Ned Land. Whenever this unknown personage was looking intently at anything, he frowned. His large eyelids contracted so as to conceal the pupils, and so considerably circumscribe his line of sight. And he did look. What a gaze it was! As if he was making distant objects larger, or penetrating your very soul by his gaze. As if he could pierce the depths of the waves, so opaque to our eyes, and could read the secrets of the sea. The two strangers wore otter-skin caps and sea boots of sealskin, and clothes of a peculiar texture which sat loosely upon them, and allowed of great freedom in their movements. The taller of the two, evidently the captain, regarded us with great attention, without speaking. Then turning to his companion, he conversed with him in a language I did not understand. The other replied by a nod, adding a few unintelligible words. Then with a glance he appeared to interrogate us personally. I replied, in good French, that I did not understand his language, but he did not appear to comprehend mine, and the situation became somewhat embarrassing. If monsieur would relate our adventures, suggested Conseil, perhaps the gentleman would understand some of it. I then commenced a recital of our experiences, distinctly dwelling upon all the words, without omitting a single detail. I pronounced our names and station. Then I presented in due form Monsieur Aronnax, his servant Conseil, and Ned Land, the harpooner. The individual with the calm eyes listened quietly, even politely, and with great attention, but his face betrayed no sign that he understood a word. When I had finished, he remained perfectly silent. There still remained the English language as a last resource. Perhaps he would understand that almost universal tongue. I was acquainted with it, and with German sufficiently to read fluently, but not to speak it correctly. And here it was absolutely necessary to be understood. "Do you try," I said to the harpooner. "Speak the best English ever heard, Master Land, and try to be more successful than I have been." Ned made no objection, and repeated my recital, so as I could understand it pretty well. The issue was the same, but the form was different. The Canadian was more energetic. He complained bitterly at being imprisoned, against the rights of nations, demanded legal satisfaction for his detention, invoked the habeas corpus act, threatened to prosecute those who kept us prisoners unlawfully. He kicked about, gesticulated, cried out, and finally, by a most expressive pantomime, gave them to understand that we were almost dying of hunger. This was true, as a matter of fact, but we had nearly forgotten it. To his intense surprise, the harpooner did not appear to have been more intelligible than I was. Our hosts did not move a muscle of their faces. It was evident that they understood neither the language of Arago nor Faraday. I was very much puzzled what to do next, when Conseil said, "If monsieur will permit me, I will speak to them in German." "What? Do you know German?" I cried. "Like a Dutchman," replied he, "if monsieur has no objection." "I am much pleased. Go on, my lad." And Conseil recounted, for the third time, the various adventures we had met with. But notwithstanding the excellent accent and the elegantly turned phrases of the speaker, German was not a success. At length, pushed to the very last position, I recalled all I could of my former studies, and essayed to tell the tale in Latin. Cicero would have stopped his ears and declared it was dog Latin, but nevertheless I went on, but with the same result. This last attempt having miscarried, the two strangers exchanged some words in their incomprehensible language, and retired, without bestowing upon us even one of those signs which are universally understood. The door was again shut upon us. "This is infamous!" exclaimed Ned Land, who burst out for the 20th time. "Why, we have spoken French, English, German, and Latin to those rascals, and they have not had the civility to reply." "Calm yourself, Ned," I said to the angry harpooner. "Anger will do no good." "But don't you know, sir, that we may die of hunger in this iron cage?" "Bah!" said Conseil with his usual philosophy. "We can hold out for some time yet." "My friends," said I, "we must not despair. We have not come to the worst yet. Do me the favour and wait before you form an opinion respecting the captain and the crew of this vessel." "My opinion is already formed," replied Ned. "They are a set of rascals." "Good. And of what country?" "Of a rascally country. My brave Ned, that country is not clearly laid down upon the map of the world, and I confess that the nationality of these two strangers is difficult to determine. They are neither English, French, nor German, we can affirm. Now I am tempted to admit that they were born in the lower latitudes. There is a southerly look about them, but whether they be Spaniards, Turks, Arabs, or Indians, their physical types do not enable me to decide. Their language is simply incomprehensible." "There is the drawback of not knowing every language," replied Conseil, "and the disadvantage of not having a universal one." "That would not help us at all," replied Ned Land. "Do you not understand that these fellows have got a language of their own, invented to drive to despair those brave people who ask for something to eat? But in any country in the world, if you open your mouth, move your jaws, smack your lips, why would they not understand what you meant? Would not that be sufficient to indicate equally in Quebec, as in Pomaton in Paris, or in the Antipodes, 'I am hungry, give me something to eat'? Oh," cried Conseil, "there are some natures so utterly stupid." As he spoke, the door opened, and a steward entered. He brought us clothing, vests, and trousers fit for sea-wear, of a material which I was unacquainted. I hastened to clothe myself, and my companions followed my example. Meantime the steward, silent, perhaps deaf, had laid the table and set on 3 dishes. "There is something satisfactory," said Conseil. "This promises well." "Bah!" cried the spiteful Canadian. "What the devil do you expect to get to eat here? Tortoise livers, fillet of shark, or a slice from a sea-dog?" "We shall soon see," replied Conseil. The dishes, with their silver covers, were placed symmetrically upon the cloth, and we took our places. Decidedly we had to do with civilized beings, and were it not for the electric light which surrounded us, I should have fancied we were sitting in the Adelphi Hotel in Liverpool, or the Grand Hotel in Paris. I must say that we had neither wine nor bread on this occasion. The water was pure and bright, but it was water, which was not acceptable to Ned Land. Amongst the meats served to us I recognized various kinds of fish very delicately cooked, but some of the dishes I could not pronounce an opinion, as I was perfectly unable to say what kingdom, animal or vegetable, they belonged. The table service was elegant and in perfect taste. Every knife, fork, spoon, or plate was marked with a letter surrounded by a motto, of which the following is a facsimile: Mobilis in mobile, N. Mobile mobile in a mobile element. This applied exactly to this submarine machine, if you translate the preposition in as in and not upon. The letter N, no doubt, stood for the initial of the name of the eccentric individual who commanded. Ned and Conseil did not waste much time in reflection. They began to eat, and I quickly followed their example. I was, moreover, now reassured as to our fate, and it was very evident that our hosts did not intend that we should die from inanition. Everything must have an end in this world, and so must the appetites of people who have fasted for 15 hours. The want of sleep now began to make itself felt. A natural reaction, after the long night during which we had struggled face to face with death. "Faith, I shall sleep well," said Conseil. "I am already asleep," replied Ned Land. My companions lay down upon the floor, and were quickly in a profound slumber. For my part, I yielded less quickly to the drowsy god. A number of thoughts crowded my brain. Insoluble questions pressed upon me. A troop of mental images kept my eyes open. Where were we? What strange power held us? I felt, or fancied I felt, the machine sinking to the bottom of the sea. Fearful nightmares beset me. I saw, in mysterious passages, the whole of the unknown animal kingdom, of which the submarine vessel appeared to be the congener, living, moving, and as formidable as they. Then my brain cooled, my imagination was steeped in sleep, and I soon fell into a peaceful slumber. Chapter 9. Ned Land's Anger. How long we slept, I do not know, but it must have been some time, as we awoke completely refreshed. I was the first to awake. My companions had not stirred, and remained stretched in a corner like lifeless beings. Scarcely had I got up from my hard bed when I perceived that my brain was clear and my mind invigorated. I then began to re-examine our cell attentively. Nothing had been altered in its arrangement. The prison was still a prison, the prisoners still prisoners. But the steward had cleared the table while we slept. There was no symptom of any approaching change for the better, and I began to wonder whether we were destined to live forever in that cage. This prospect was so much more the unpleasant as, if my brain were clear, I felt my chest very much oppressed. My breathing had become difficult. The heavy air was not sufficient for the play of my lungs. The cell was certainly of large size, but it was evident that we had consumed the greater part of the oxygen it had contained. Each man breathes in an hour the amount of oxygen contained in 100 litres of atmospheric air, and this air, then almost equal to carbonic acid gas, becomes insupportable. It was, therefore, necessary to renovate the air out of our prison, and, without doubt, also the atmosphere of our submarine boat. Here was a puzzling question. How did the commander of the floating dwelling get on? Did he obtain air by chemical means, by disengaging the oxygen contained in chlorate of potash, and by absorbing the carbonic acid by the caustic potash? In this case, he must keep up a communication with the earth to obtain a supply of these materials. Did he only take the precaution to store the air under great pressure in reservoirs, and free it again according to the requirements of the ship's company? Perhaps so. Or, what was a much easier method, more economical and therefore more probable, was that he came up to the surface of the water to breathe, like a cetacean, for 24 hours, and for 24 hours renew his supply of oxygen. However it might be, and by whatever means, it appeared to be prudent to deploy it without delay. In fact, I was already obliged to breathe more quickly to extract what little oxygen the cell contained, when I was suddenly refreshed by a current of pure air, perfumed with the odour of the sea. It was the true sea breeze, vivified and charged with iodine. I opened my mouth wide. I was sensible of a rocking motion, a rolling of some extent, but perfectly determinable. The monster had evidently come up to the surface to breathe, after the fashion of the whale. The mode of ventilating the ship was now perfectly apparent. While I was enjoying the pure air, I looked for the medium of its introduction, and was not long in discovering it. Over the door was an aperture, through which the fresh air entered and renovated the vitiated atmosphere of the cabin. I had got so far in my observations when Ned and Conseil woke almost at the same time, under the influence of the fresh air. After sundry rubbings of the eyes and stretchings of the arms, they got upon their feet. "Has monsieur slept well?" inquired Conseil with his usual politeness. "Very well indeed," I replied. "And you, Master Land?" "Soundly," was the answer. "But perhaps I am mistaken. I fancy I can detect the smell of the sea." The sailor could make no mistake on this point, and I told the Canadian what had passed. "That explains the roarings we heard when the supposed narwhal was so near the Abraham Lincoln," said Ned. "Quite so, Ned. That was its breathing. Only, Monsieur Aronnax, I have no notion what time it is, unless it is dinner time." "Dinner time, my worthy harpooner? Say rather breakfast time, for we are certainly in another day, which shows that we have slept for 24 hours. "That is my opinion," I replied. "I will not contradict you," replied Ned Land, "but dinner or breakfast I shall be glad to see the steward, whichever he may bring." "Both," replied Conseil. "Just so," replied Ned. "We are entitled to 2 meals, and for my part I could do justice to both." "Listen, Ned," said I. "It is very evident that these people do not intend to starve us, else the dinner yesterday would have had no meaning." "Unless they want to fatten us up a bit. I must protest against that. I must protest against that," said I. "We have not fallen among cannibals." "Once is not a custom," replied the Canadian seriously. "Who can tell whether these people have not been deprived of flesh meat for some time? And, in that case, 3 such individuals as you, monsieur, your servant, and I, banish such thoughts, Land," I said, "and above all things, do not go out of your way to abuse our hosts. That will only make matters worse." "In any case," said Ned, "I am as hungry as 1,000 devils. Dinner or breakfast, the meal is not here." "We must conform to the regulations of the ship," I replied. "Possibly our appetites are in advance of the galley clock." "And I suppose that is set correctly," said Conseil calmly. "That is so like you, friend Conseil," replied the impetuous Canadian. "You don't ever trouble yourself much. You are always calm. You are the kind of fellow to say grace before your benedicite, and die of hunger rather than complain. Excuse me." "And what is the use of complaining?" asked Conseil. "But it will do good. And if these pirates, I say pirates with all respect, as the professor objects to my calling them cannibals, and I don't want to hurt his feelings, if these pirates imagine that they are going to keep me a prisoner in this stifling cage without hearing some pretty strong observations from me, they are very much mistaken. Look here, Mr. Aronnax, tell me frankly, do you think we should be kept long in this iron box? To say the truth, I cannot tell any more than yourself." "Well, but what do you think?" "I imagine that chance has made us masters of an important secret. Now, if the crew of this submarine vessel are much interested in keeping it, and if such interest is as important as the lives of 3 men, I do think that we are in danger. But in the contrary case, the monster may put us ashore again amongst our species." "Unless he enroll us with the crew," said Conseil, "and take care of his secret that way." "Until some day," replied Ned, "when some frigate better found and faster than the Abraham Lincoln takes possession of this nest of robbers, and sends us and them to swing at the yardarm." "A good argument, Land," said I, "but nothing of all this has yet happened. It is useless to discuss what may happen until the case arises. I repeat, let us wait and act according to circumstances. We need do nothing because there is nothing to do." "On the contrary, sir," replied the Canadian, who would not give in, "we ought to do something." "Well, what?" "Save ourselves. Try to escape." "To escape from a prison on land is difficult, but to get out of a submarine prison appears to me impracticable." "Now, friend Ned," said Conseil, "what do you say to monsieur? I cannot believe that an American is ever at a loss." The harpooner, visibly embarrassed, was silent. Flight under the circumstances was out of the question, but a Canadian is half a Frenchman, and Master Land showed that by his reply. "So, Mr. Aronnax," he said after some minutes' consideration, "you do not know what people ought to do who cannot escape from their prison?" "No, my friend. It is very simple. They ought to arrange in what manner they will remain." "By Jove," said Conseil, "I think you are better inside either above or below. But having overcome jailers, keys, and bolts? What, Ned, is it possible that you are seriously contemplating escape from this vessel?" "Very seriously indeed," replied the Canadian. "Impossible." "Why so, sir?" "Some favourable opportunity may arise, and I do not see why I should not profit by it. If there are not more than 20 men on board, they will not be able to resist 2 Frenchmen and a Canadian, I suppose." It was better to admit this proposition than to discuss it, so I contented myself by saying, "Wait events and see. But till the time comes, pray curb your impatience. We cannot act except by stratagem, and it is not in our power to create opportunities, so promise me that you will take things as they come, quietly." "I promise, sir," replied Ned in a tone but little reassuring. "Not a coarse nor violent word shall pass my lips, not a gesture shall be perceived, even if the table be not served with desirable regularity." "I have your promise, Ned," I replied. Our conversation ceased, and each of us began to reflect. For myself, I confess, notwithstanding the assurance of the harpooner, I did not delude myself. I did not admit those favourable chances of which Ned had spoken. To be so well manoeuvred, the submarine boat must be well manned and equipped, and consequently, in the event of a dispute, we should get the worst of it. Besides, above all, it was necessary to be at liberty, and we were not. I did not perceive any means of flight from this close prison, and if the strange commander of this vessel had a secret to preserve, which was at least probable, he would not permit us to be at large on board. Now, whether he would get rid of us by violence, or land us safely upon some corner of the earth, was the question. All these hypotheses appeared to me extremely plausible, and one needed to be a harpooner to hope to regain his liberty. I comprehended, moreover, that Ned Land's intentions were by no means in keeping with his reflections. I heard him beginning to mutter strange oaths, and his gestures were becoming threatening. He got up and walked about like a wild beast in a cage, hitting and kicking the walls as he passed by. By and by his anger evaporated, and hunger began to assail him cruelly, and yet the steward appeared not. Our position, as shipwrecked people, had been forgotten too long, if they had really been well-intentioned towards us. Ned Land, really suffering from hunger, got more and more angry, and, notwithstanding his promise, I was afraid of an explosion should any of the crew enter our cabin. For 2 hours longer, Ned's anger burned. He called, he shouted in vain. The walls were impervious to sound. I could not hear any sound within the boat. It was not moving, for we should in that event have felt the throbbings of the screw. Plunged in this state of uncertainty beneath the waves, we seemed to belong to earth no more. The death-like silence was appalling. I did not dare to contemplate the chances of a lengthened abandonment and isolation in this cell. The hopes I had conceived after our interview with the commander faded by degrees. His kind expression of countenance, pleasant look, and nobility of mien all faded from my memory. I recalled this extraordinary personage, as he had now become, necessarily pitiless and cruel. I put him out of the pale of humanity, inaccessible to every sentiment of pity, the remorseless enemy of his fellow creatures against whom he had sworn an undying enmity. But was this man then going to let us perish of hunger, incarcerated in an iron cell, at the mercy of those terrible temptations which assail men under the influence of extreme hunger? This fearful thought burnt itself into my brain, and imagination being at work, I felt myself becoming the prey of a maddening terror. Conseil was quite resigned. Ned was raging. At this juncture, a voice was heard outside. Footsteps were heard on the iron flooring. The bolts were drawn back, and the steward appeared. Before I could interpose to prevent him, the Canadian had thrown himself upon the unfortunate man, felled him to the ground, where he held him by the throat. The steward was strangling beneath that powerful grasp. Conseil had already attempted to loosen the deadly grasp with the harpooner, and I was about to assist, when I was glued to the spot by hearing a voice call out in French, "Calm yourself, Mr. Land, and you also, Professor, and be so good as to listen to me." Chapter 10. The Man of the Sea. It was the commander of the vessel who had spoken. At those words, Ned Land suddenly arose. The steward, half strangled, staggered out at a sign from his master, but such was the discipline and force that the man did not even by a gesture betray his resentment against the Canadian. Conseil was interested, in spite of himself, and I stood petrified with astonishment. We all awaited the denouement in silence. The commander, leaning against the table, regarded us fixedly. Did he hesitate to speak, or was he regretting having addressed us in French? It might be so. After a silence of some minutes, which none of us ventured to break, "Gentlemen," said he in a calm and penetrating tone, "I can speak French, English, German, and Latin with equal facility, and was therefore quite capable of replying to you at our first interview, but I wished to learn first, and reflect afterwards. Your respective accounts of your adventures, agreeing in all important particulars, assured me of your identity. I am now aware that chance has brought to me Monsieur Pierre Aronnax, Professor of Natural History at the Museum of Paris, charged with a scientific mission. Conseil, his servant, and Ned Land, a Canadian by birth, harpooner on board the frigate Abraham Lincoln of the United States Navy. I bowed assent. There was no necessity for further reply. The man expressed himself with perfect ease, and with no foreign accent. His phraseology was good, his words well chosen, his facility of speech remarkable. Nevertheless, I did not take to him as a countryman. He continued, "You have doubtless thought that I have been a long time in paying you a second visit. It was because your identity once established, I wished to consider seriously how to act towards you. I hesitated for a long time. Unfortunate circumstances have brought you in contact with a man who has forsworn his fellow creatures. You have come to disturb my existence." "Unintentionally," I put it. "Unintentionally," repeated the stranger, raising his voice. "Was it unintentionally that the Abraham Lincoln chased me through the ocean so long? Was it unintentionally that you came on board that ship? Was it unintentionally that your shot came hustling against the hull of my vessel? Was it unintentionally that Land here struck it with his harpoon?" I perceived a subdued anger in all these questions, but to all these recriminations I had a perfectly plain answer to make, and I made it. "Monsieur," said I, "you are ignorant of the discussions which have arisen in Europe and America about you. You are not aware that the various collisions you have caused have evoked public observation in both continents. I spare you the numerous hypotheses by which people have endeavoured to explain the inexplicable phenomenon of which you alone possess the secret. But you must know that in pursuing you, the Abraham Lincoln's crew were under the impression that they were pursuing some powerful marine monster, of which it was necessary to rid the ocean at any cost." A half sigh parted the lips of the stranger. Then, in a calmer tone, "Monsieur Aronnax, can you confirm that your frigate would not have followed and fired at a submarine vessel as well as a monster?" The question caused me some little embarrassment, for certainly Commodore Farragut had not hesitated. He would have deemed it his duty to destroy an apparatus of the kind as well as a gigantic narwhal. "So you perceive, monsieur," said the stranger, "that I have a right to treat you as enemies." I did not reply, and for good reason. Where was the use to answer a proposition when force could overcome 1,000 arguments? "I have hesitated for a long time," said the commander. "There is no reason why I should extend my hospitality to you. If I leave you, I have no interest in seeing you again. If I replace you upon the platform outside upon which you took refuge, I can sink beneath the surface and forget that you ever existed. Have I not this right?" These thoughts chased rapidly across my mind, while the strange personage was silent, absorbed and plunged in thought. I was regarding him with a melancholy interest, much as Oedipus may have looked at the Sphinx. After a long silence, the commander spoke again. "I have waited before speaking," said he, "because I was thinking that my own interest may be in keeping with the natural consideration to which every human being has a right. You shall remain on board, since fate has thrown you in my way. You will be free here, and in exchange for this liberty I will only impose one condition. Your word of honour that you agree to it will be sufficient." "Speak, monsieur," said I. "I have no doubt the condition is one that brave men may accept." "Certainly, and this is it. It is possible that certain circumstances may compel me to confine you to your cabin for some hours on some days. As I have no wish to use force, I expect from you, above all, the most passive obedience. In acting thus, I take all responsibility off your shoulders, and you are free. For it will be my business to see that you do not become acquainted with what it is inexpedient for you to know. Do you accept the condition?" "We accept," I replied, "but I wish to ask one question. Only one." "Speak, monsieur," he said. "You have stated that we shall be free on board?" "Entirely." "I would ask what you mean by such freedom?" "Permission to go and come and look about as you please, to see all that takes place here. In fact, the same freedom as I and my companions enjoy." "That is perhaps the right of a savage," I said, but not of a civilized being. Monsieur, I am not, so to speak, a civilized being. I have broken with the world altogether, for reasons which I can alone appreciate. I obey no laws, and I recommend you never put them to me. And I recommend you never to put them in force against me. This was sternly spoken. An angry and disdainful gleam shone in his eyes, and in this man's life I could discern a terrible past. Not only that he put himself out of reach of all human laws, but he was independent, free in the largest acceptation of the term, beyond all reach. Who would dare to pursue to the bottom of the sea a being who at the surface baffled all efforts to overtake him? What ship could resist the shock of this submarine ram? What armor plate could sustain his blows? None among men could demand an account of his actions. Providence, if he believed in him, his conscience, if he had one, were the only judges before whom he could ever be brought. It was evident that we did not altogether understand each other. I beg your pardon, I added, but the liberty you would accord is only that granted to a prisoner, to walk round his prison. That is not enough for us. Well, it must suffice, nevertheless. What, you would debar us from ever seeing our friends, relatives, and our native land again? Yes, monsieur. But to renounce the insupportable yoke of earth which men call freedom is not such a very great sacrifice as you imagine. Well, cried Ned, I will never give my word of honour not to attempt to escape. I did not ask for your word of honour, Master Land, replied the commander in a freezing tone. Sir, said I, carried away in spite of myself, you take an unfair advantage of your position. It is cruel. No, sir, it is mercy. You are my prisoners of war. I take care of you when, by a word, I could have you thrown into the sea. You have attacked me. You have come here and have discovered a secret which no one in the world ought to know, the secret of my existence. And do you believe that I shall put you ashore upon that earth which shall know me no more? In keeping you here, it is not you whom I take care of. It is myself. These words indicated a resolution which no argument could overturn. Thus, I replied, you give us simply a choice between life and death? Exactly. My friends, said I, to such a question there is no answer, but we are not bound to the master of the ship. Not at all, replied the captain. Then in a more pleasant tone he resumed. Now permit me to finish what I have to say. I know you, Monsieur Aronnax. You, personally, have not perhaps much reason to complain that you have cast in your lot with mine. You will find amongst the books which are my favourite studies your own work upon the greatest depths of the sea. I have often read it. You have extended your work as far as terrestrial science permitted. But you do not know everything, and have not seen everything. Allow me to tell you that you will not regret the time you pass on board with me. You are about to sail through a world of wonders. Astonishment and stupefaction will be the prevailing feelings you will experience. You will not easily get tired of the never-ceasing spectacle before you. I am about to make a new tour of the submarine world, perhaps the last, who knows, to study, as far as possible, at the bottom of these seas, of those seas through which I have so frequently coursed, and you shall be my companion. From this day you will enter upon a new existence. You will see what no man has ever seen. For my companions and myself do not count, and our planet, thanks to me, shall yield its deepest secrets to you. I could not deny it. The captain's words had a great effect upon me. I was assailed at my weak point, and forgot, at the moment, that my contemplation of these wonderful things could not compensate for my lost liberty. However, I counted upon the future to solve this question, so I answered, Monsieur, if you have quarrelled with humanity, I like to think that you have not renounced every human feeling. We are shipwrecked people, received charitably on board your vessel. We do not forget that. As for me, I am not sure but that, if the interests of science will permit me to forget the want of freedom, I can promise myself that our intercourse will be very pleasant. I fancied that the commander would tender me his hand to ratify our agreement. He did not do so, and, for his sake, I was sorry for it. One last question, I said, as this strange individual was about to retire. Well, monsieur? By what name shall I address you?" "Sir," he replied, "to you I am but Captain Nemo, and your companions and yourself are to me only passengers in the ship Nautilus." Captain Nemo then called the steward, to whom he gave his orders in that strange language, which I could not make out. Then, turning to Conseil and the Canadian, he said to them, "A meal awaits you in your cabin. Be so good as to follow that man." "This is not to be refused," said the harpooner, and Conseil and he quitted the cell in which they had been interned 30 hours. "Now, Monsieur Aronnax, our breakfast is ready. Allow me to lead the way." "At your orders, Captain." I followed Captain Nemo, and as soon as I passed the door, I entered a sort of corridor, illuminated by electric light and resembling the waist of a ship. After proceeding a short distance, a second door was opened before me. I was ushered in a dining room ornamented and furnished in perfect taste. Oaken shelves, inlaid with ebony, were erected at each end of this room, upon which were displayed, in varying order, china, earthenware, porcelain, and glass of inestimable value. The table services glittered beneath the rays which extended to the ceiling, whose fine frescoes toned down the powerful light. In the centre of the room was a splendidly served table. Captain Nemo pointed out my place. "Sit down," said he, "and eat like a man who is dying of hunger." The meal was composed of a certain number of dishes which only the sea could have supplied, and some of which I was entirely ignorant. They were very good, but of curious flavour, to which, however, I speedily became accustomed. These various dishes were rich in phosphorus, and from this I argued that they were of oceanic origin. Captain Nemo was looking at me. I asked him nothing, but he divined my thoughts, and replied voluntarily to the questions I was burning to address to him. "The greater part of these dishes are unknown," said he, "but you may eat without fear. They are wholesome and nourishing. For years I have renounced all sustenance derived from the earth, and am none the worse. My crew, who are strong fellows, live as I do." "All these things are produced in the sea, then?" "Yes. The ocean furnishes me with all I require. Sometimes I spread my nets astern and haul them in ready to break. Sometimes I go hunting in this element, so inaccessible to man, and I take the game that inhabits the submarine forests. My flocks, like those of Father Neptune, feed fearlessly in the submarine pastures, and share a vast estate which I cultivate myself, and which is always sown by the hand of the Creator of all things." I gazed at Captain Nemo in astonishment, and replied, "I can quite understand that your nets furnish you excellent fish, but I do not quite comprehend how you hunt the aquatic game in the submarine forests, and least of all, why so small a portion of meat appears at your table." "For the reason that I never consume the flesh of terrestrial animals." "But this, now," I retorted, pointing to a dish upon which some slices of a fillet were placed, "that which you believe to be meat is nothing but tortoise fillet. Here is likewise some dolphin liver which you might take for pork. My cook is an experienced hand, and excels in preparing the various productions of the sea. Taste those. Here is a conserve d'olio, some French, which Malays declared unrivalled. Here is a cream made of the milk from the breast of a cetacean, and sugar from the great fucus of the North Sea. And, finally, allow me to offer you these confiture d'anemones, which are equal to the most pleasant fruits." I tasted them more out of curiosity than hunger, while Captain Nemo amused me by his improbable tales. "But this inexhaustible sea not only feeds but clothes me. That material you wear is made from the byssus of certain shellfish. They are coloured with the purple of the ancients, variegated with violet tints, which I extract from the plecis of the Mediterranean. The perfumes you will find upon your dressing table have been produced by the distillation of marine plants. Your bed is composed of the softest zostera of the ocean. Your pen is from the fin of a whale. Your ink is the liquor secreted by the cuttlefish. Everything now comes from the sea, and will return to it again some day." "You are fond of the sea, Captain." "Yes, I love it. The sea is everything. It covers 7/10 of the terrestrial globe. Its breathings are pure and healthy. It is an immense desert in which man is never lonely, for life is spread around him. The sea is only the medium for a supernatural and wonderful existence. It is nothing but movement and affection, the living infinite, as one of the poets has said. In fact, nature is herein represented by all three kingdoms, the mineral, vegetable, and animal. The last is largely represented by the four groups of zoophytes, three classes of articulated animals, 5 classes of mollusks, 3 classes of vertebrates, the mammifers, reptiles, innumerable legions of fish, an infinite order of animals, which includes more than 13,000 species, of which only a 10th part inhabit fresh water. The sea is the vast reservoir of nature. It was by the sea that the world may be said to have commenced, and who knows whether it will not finish it also. There alone is perfect quiet. The sea is not for despots. At the surface it can still exercise its iniquitous rights. There it beats furiously and devours greedily. There it bears all earthly horrors. But at 30 feet below the surface its power ceases. Its influence is extinguished. Its strength dies out. Ah, monsieur, live in the bosom of the waters. There alone you will find independence. There I recognize no master. There I am free. Captain Nemo suddenly stopped in the midst of his enthusiastic address. Had he been betrayed out of his habitual reserve? Had he said too much? For some time he walked about, evidently agitated. Then he became calmer. His face resumed its usual impassibility, and turning to me, he said, "Now, monsieur, if you wish to inspect the Nautilus, I am at your service." And that is where I shall take my first break. So, you know what to do, or maybe you don't, in which case your instructions are to do what you need to do. Feel free to get up, have a stretch, walk around, rotate your fluids, do whatever you need. And I will be back in 5 minutes time, so I will see you on the other side of the break. Thank you. Well, hello, and welcome back. I hope that everyone has had a good break and done whatever it was you needed to do. I myself have taken a very important picture of my cat who is asleep on the bed. And that was really about the most of it. I still have water. You'll be happy to know, obviously, concern for my well-being and all that. And yeah, I guess without much ado, I'll crack on and see what other fun, unexpected French words I'm going to get thrown at. I'm going to have thrown at me, because that's always a fun thing to just stumble across in the middle of a sentence. Yeah. All right, let's continue. Chapter 9: The Nautilus. Captain Nemo got up from his chair. I followed him. A double door at the end of the room was passed, and we entered a chamber of similar size that we had just left. It was a library. High ebony bookcases, inlaid with brass, contained a large number of books similarly bound. These followed the curvature of the walls, and terminated at their lowest part in large sofas covered with maroon leather, which presented most comfortable resting places. Light, movable desks were attached thereto, adapted either for reading or writing. In the centre was a large table, littered with pamphlets, and here and there some old newspapers. The electric light fell upon all these from 4 swinging globular lamps fastened in the fluting of the ceiling. I gazed admiringly around me at this ingeniously arranged room, and could scarcely believe my eyes. "Captain Nemo," said I to my host, who had stretched himself out upon a couch, "this library would do credit to a palace, and I'm fairly astounded when I reflect that it can be equally available at the bottom of the sea." "You can find true solitude and silence here," replied the captain. "I do not think that your study at the museum can offer you such perfect quiet." "No, indeed, and it will appear very poor after this. You must have 6,000 or 7,000 volumes on these shelves." 12,000, replied Captain Nemo. "Those are the only things that bind me to the earth. The world was dead to me when my Nautilus plunged for the first time beneath the waves. Upon that day I purchased my last volumes, my last pamphlets, my last papers, and since then I wish to believe that the human race has neither thought nor written anything. These books are, however, quite at your disposal, and you may use them freely." I thanked my host and approached the shelves. There were books of science and moral and literary subjects in every language, but I did not perceive any work upon political economy. One curious feature was that the books were mingled together, not arranged according to the language in which they were written, and this seemed to prove that the captain read whatever volumes came to hand. Amongst the books I noticed the greatest works of ancient and modern celebrities, that is to say, all the finest works that humanity has produced. There was poetry, romance and science represented, from Homer to Victor Hugo, from Xenophon to Michelet, from Rabelais to Madame Sand. But science composed the bulk of the works. Books upon mechanics, ballistics, hydrography, meteorology, geography, geology, etc. held a no less important place than works on natural history, which I fancied was the captain's chief study. I perceived the complete writings of Humboldt, Arago, Foucault, Henry Sinclair Deville, Charles, Milne Edwards, Cottefage, Tyndall, Faraday, Berthelot, and of the Abbé Secchi, Peterman, Commodore Murray, Agassiz, etc., the memoirs of the Academy of Science, the transactions of various geographical societies, etc., and in a conspicuous position, those 2 volumes to which, perhaps, I was indebted for Captain Nemo's clemency. Amongst the works of Joseph Bertrand, his book entitled Les Fondateurs de l'Astronomie gave me a fixed date, and I knew that the book had appeared during the year 1865. I was enabled to arrive at the conclusion that the institution of the Nautilus had not been at a date more remote than that. Thus, for 3 years or more, Captain Nemo had led a submarine existence. I was in hopes that more recent works would enable me to fix more definitely the exact period, but I had plenty of time before me, and I did not wish to delay an exploration of the wonders of the Nautilus. "I thank you," said I to the captain, "for having placed this library at my disposal. There are some treasures of scientific research which I shall be able to profit by." "This is not only a library, it is also a smoking room," said he. "A smoking room!" I exclaimed. "So you have some cigars on board?" "Certainly." "Then I am obliged to think that you must preserve relations with Havana." "Not at all," replied the captain. "Try this cigar, and though it is very certain it never came from Havana, I think you will like the flavour." I took the cigar, which was made like those sold in London, but it appeared to be composed of leaves of gold. I lit it at a little bronze brazier, and inhaled its fragrance with all the gusto of a man who had not smoked for 2 days. "It is excellent," I said, "but it is not tobacco." "No," replied the captain, "that weed never grew in Havana nor the East. It is a kind of seaweed, rich in nicotine, which the ocean supplies to me somewhat sparely. Do you regret your London cigar?" "My dear sir, I shall despise them henceforth." "Well, then, smoke as much as you like, and without thinking of the origin of the cigars. They bear the brand of no nation, but they are not the less good, I fancy." "On the contrary." Captain Nemo then opened a door opposite to that by which we had entered, and I passed into a large, brilliantly lighted salon. It was a large oblong with walls sloping inwards, 10 yards long, 6 wide, and 5 high. The lighted ceiling, decorated by arabesques, distributed a clear and soft light upon all the marvels of this museum, for a museum it really was, in which an intelligent and prodigal mind had united all the treasures of nature and art, with a little of that mixing which distinguishes the studio of a painter. 30 masterpieces in handsome frames ornamented the walls, covered with tapestry of chaste design. Here I perceived pictures of the greatest value, which for the most part I had admired in private collections and exhibitions. The various schools of the old masters were represented by a Madonna by Raphael, a Virgin by Leonardo da Vinci, a Nymph by Correggio, a Lady by Titian, an Adoration by Veronese, an Assumption by Murillo, a Portrait by Holbein, a Monk by Velasquez, a Martyr by Ribera, a Kermesse by Rubens, 2 Flemish landscapes by Teniers, 3 small pictures of that school of Gerard Dow, Metsu, and Paul Potter, 2 by Géricault and Proudhon, some sea views by Bacqueisen and Vernet. Amongst modern works were those of Delacroix, Ingres, Descamps, Troyon, Meissonier, Daubigny, etc., and some admirable reductions from statues of the first models stood upon pedestals in the corners of this splendid museum. The state of stupefaction predicted by the captain of the Nautilus had already taken possession of my mind. "Monsieur," said the extraordinary man, "you will, I hope, excuse the informal manner in which I have received you, and the disorder of this room." "Without seeking to know who you are, sir," I said, "I may remark that you are an artist." "An amateur, no more. I like to collect these beautiful specimens of human workmanship. I was a great collector at one time, and have been able to obtain some works of great value. These are the last souvenirs of the earth, which is now dead to me. To my eyes, your modern artists cannot compare with the old masters who have 200 or 300 years' existence. I confuse them. And I confuse them. They have no age." "And these musicians," said I, pointing out works of Weber, Rossini, Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, Meyerbeer, Harold, Wagner, Auber, Gounod, and others scattered upon a piano organ, which filled up one of the panels of the room. "Those musicians," replied Captain Nemo, "are contemporaries of Orpheus, for chronological difficulties are passed over in the memories of dead men. And I am dead, equally dead as any of your friends lying 6 feet underground." He ceased speaking, and appeared plunged in a profound reverie. I gazed at him with emotion, analysing his features in silence. Leaning against a beautiful mosaic table, he was quite unconscious of my presence. I respectfully recalled his attention, and we continued to inspect the curiosities of the salon. After the works of art, the rare natural specimens held the most important position. They consisted chiefly of plants, shells, and other productions of the ocean, which Captain Nemo had himself picked up. In the centre of the room was a small jet of water, illuminated by the electric light, and falling into a simple tridone. This shell, produced by the greatest of acephalous mollusks, measured about 6 yards around the delicately curved edge. It thus surpassed in size those that were presented to Francis I by the Republic of Venice, and of which the church of St. Sulpice in Paris had constructed 2 immense holy water basins. Around this vase were classed and ticketed the most precious productions of the sea that had ever gladdened the eyes of a naturalist. You can picture my delight. Zoophytes presented most curious specimens of the 2 groups of polyps and echinoderms. In the first group, tubiphores, gorgons displayed fanwise, soft sponges from Syria, etc., and a series of those madrepores which my master, Milne Edwards, had so cleverly classed in sections. In fine, the whole represented a collection complete in individual specimens of the various groups. The collection of shells was of inestimable value, and time would fail me in attempting to describe them all. Amongst them I well remember the elegant royal hammerfish of the Indian Ocean, whose regularly placed white spots showed out upon the red or brown beneath. An imperial spondide of vivid colouring, bristling with spines, a rare specimen in European museums, and worth, I should say, 20,000 francs. A common specimen of hammerfish from New Holland, where it is not easy to procure, however. Bucardia of Senegal, fragile white bivalves, which one may blow away like a soap bubble. A whole series of trochai, some greenish-brown from American waters, some a reddish-brown related to those of New Holland. The former from the Gulf of Mexico, remarkable for their imbricated shells, the latter from Stellaria, found in the South Seas, and rarest of all, the magnificent spar shell of New Zealand, and in fine ovula, olivia, bikini, voluta, harper, cassis, cerathea, fissurella, patella, and other delicate and fragile shells, to which science has given most charming names, and then asked me to read them. Besides, and in special compartments were displayed rows of pearls of great beauty, which the electric light tipped with little scintillations. Rose pearls torn from the Red Sea, green pearls of the halistoid iris, yellow pearls, and blue and black, curious products of various mollusks in every ocean, and in certain watercourses, besides many other specimens of immense value. Some of these pearls surpassed a pigeon's egg in size, and were worth more than that which the traveller Tavernier sold to the Shah of Persia for 3 millions, and excelled that other pearl of the Imam of Muscat, which I fancied without a rival in the world. So to calculate the value of this collection was almost impossible. Captain Nemo must have spent millions on his specimens, and I was thinking how could he thus afford to gratify his tastes, when I was interrupted by his saying, "You are examining my shells, monsieur. They can interest a naturalist, but they have a greater charm for me, for I have collected them all myself, and there is not any part of the oceanic world that has escaped my search." "I can quite understand," said I, "the pleasure of floating in the midst of such riches. You are one of those who have made their own fortune. No museum in Europe possesses such a collection as yours. But if I go on admiring these shells, I shall have no wonder left for the vessel that carries us. I do not wish to pry into your secrets, but I confess that the speed of the Nautilus, the machinery that guides her, the power that animates her, all have excited my curiosity to a very high pitch. I see hanging from these walls some instruments of whose uses I am unacquainted. May I know what they are?" "Monsieur Aronnax," replied the captain, "I have already told you that you are free on board my ship, and so no part of the Nautilus is forbidden you. You can go over her, and I shall be very happy to be your conductor." "I really don't know how to thank you, monsieur, but I will not abuse your confidence. I will only inquire the uses of those instruments." "Similar instruments will be found in my room, and I will explain their uses there. But first, come and see your own cabin. You ought to know how you are likely to be lodged on board the Nautilus." I followed the captain, who, by one of the doors pierced in each side of the room, brought us back to the waist of the ship. He led the way forward, and there I found not merely a cabin, but an elegantly fitted chamber containing a bed, wardrobe, and other furnitures. I was not able to express my thanks to my host. "Your room is contiguous to mine," said he, opening a door as he spoke, "and mine opens into the room we have just left." I entered his room. It had an austere appearance, almost monkish. An iron bedstead, a work table, and some toilet furniture. The light was dim. There was nothing cosy about it. What was necessary was there, but nothing more. Captain Nemo pointed to a seat. "Won't you sit down?" he said. I sat down, and he addressed me as follows. Chapter 12. Entirely by Electricity. "Monsieur," said he, as he indicated the instrument suspended against the walls of the room, "there is the apparatus necessary for the navigation of the Nautilus. Here, as in the other room, I have them always under my eyes, and they point out to me my exact situation and direction mid-ocean. Some of them are known to you, such as the thermometer, which tells me the temperature of the Nautilus, the barometer, which tells me the weight of the air and predicts changes of weather, the hygrometer, which marks the dryness of the atmosphere, the storm glass, whose mixture decomposing tells me of the approaching tempest, the compass, which guides me, the sextant, which, by the sun's altitude, tells me my latitude, the chronometers, which show my longitude, and finally the day and night telescopes, by which I can scrutinize all parts of the ocean when the Nautilus comes up to the surface of the sea. These are the instruments in general use on board the ship," I said, "and I know their uses, but there are some others, intended no doubt for the peculiar requirements of the Nautilus. That dial plate I see with the movable needle, is it a manometer?" "It is a manometer. In fact, placed in the water, of which it indicates the exterior pressure, it gives me at the same time the depth at which I am keeping my boat." "And those novel sounding lines?" "They are the thermometric leads, which inform me of the temperature at various depths." "And those instruments, with the use of which I am unacquainted. On these points I must give you some little explanation, if you will listen to me." After a short pause he recommenced. "There is an agent here, powerful, obedient, rapid in action, natural, which adapts itself to everything on board. It does everything by itself. It gives me light. It warms me. It is the very soul of my mechanical arrangements. This agent is electricity." "Electricity!" I exclaimed. "Yes, monsieur." "But," said I, "you move at a great pace, which is not in accord with the power of electricity. So far as we know, its dynamic power remains very limited, and is not able to produce any great forces." "Monsieur," replied Captain Nemo, "my electricity is not that of the world in general, and that is all I feel at liberty to tell you. I will not insist upon it, of course, and will content myself by being very much astonished at the result. One question I would ask, to which of course you need not reply. Do not the elements you employ soon expend themselves? Zinc, for instance, how can you replace it if you have no communication with the land?" "Your question shall have an answer," replied Captain Nemo. "I may tell you, however, that mines of zinc, iron, silver, and gold all exist at the bottom of the sea, and the exploration of them is surely practicable. But I am in no wise indebted to the minerals of earth, and I ask only the sea to produce my electricity." "The sea?" "Yes, and by means of these I have been able to establish a circuit between the threads, cast in different depths, to obtain electricity by the difference of the temperature they underwent. But I prefer an easier plan." "And that is?" "You know the composition of seawater. In 1,000 grams there is 96.5% of water, 2 1/3% of chloride of sodium, and then small quantities of chlorides of magnesium and potash, bromide of magnesium, sulfate of magnesia, sulfate and carbonate of lime. So you perceive that the chloride of sodium is present in a large proportion. Now, it is this sodium which I extract from the water, and of which I make my elements. The sodium? Yes. Mixed with mercury, it forms an amalgam, which takes the place of the zinc in the Bunsen elements. The mercury remains, the sodium only gives off, and the sea itself furnishes that. I may tell you, moreover, that the sodium battery may be considered as the most powerful, and the electric force is double that of the zinc battery. I quite understand the value of the sodium and the condition in which you find it. The sea contains it, so far so good, but still it is necessary to extract it. How do you do that? Your batteries could evidently be of use to extract it, but if I do not mistake, the expenditure of sodium necessitated by the electric apparatus exceeds the quantity extracted, so you would consume more of it than you could produce. But I do not extract it by the assistance of the battery. I simply employ the heat of pit coal. Pit coal? I said meaningly. Well, let us say sea coal, if you prefer it, replied Captain Nemo. And can you dig out mines of sea coal? Mr. Aronnax, you shall see me work it. I only ask a little patience, since you have time to be patient. Only recollect this. I owe everything to the ocean. It produces electricity, and electricity gives the Nautilus heat, light, speed, and, in a word, life. But not the air you breathe. Oh, I can make the air necessary for my use, but it is unnecessary, since I go up to the surface whenever I please. However, if electricity do not furnish me with air to breathe, it at least sets in motion some powerful pumps, which enable me to store in reservoirs for the purpose, sufficient to enable me to remain, at need, as long as I choose at the bottom of the sea. Captain Nemo, said I can only admire you. You have discovered what men will some day find out, the truly dynamic power of electricity. I do not know if they will or not, replied Nemo coldly. However that may be, you already know the first application that I make of this precious agent. It gives us light with an equality and continuity equal to the sun. Now that clock is electric and goes with a regularity that defies 1,000 chronometers. I have divided it into 24 hours, like the Italian clocks, for me no night exists, and no day, nor sun, nor moon, but only this artificial light, which I produce from the depths of the sea. Look, at this moment it is 10 a.m. Just so. Here is another application of electricity. That dial hanging before us indicates the speed of the vessel. An electric cord places it in communication with the screw's log, and the needle indicates the speed. Look here, at this moment we are going at the moderate speed of 15 miles an hour. It is indeed marvellous, and I see that you are right to employ this agent which is destined to supersede wind, water, and steam. We have not finished yet, Monsieur Aronnax. If you like to follow me, we will go astern. I was already acquainted with the forward portion of the ship, which was divided into two parts in the centre. The salle à manger separated from the library by a watertight bulkhead. The library, the grand saloon, separated from the captain's room by another watertight partition. This room and mine and an air reservoir composed the forward portion, in all 35 yards in length. The bulkheads were pierced with doors, which could be hermetically sealed and assured the safety of the Nautilus in the event of any influx of water. I followed Captain Nemo across the waist, and reached the centre. There was a sort of well which opened between two bulkheads. An iron ladder led upwards. I asked the use to which this ladder was put. It leads to the launch. What, have you a boat too? Certainly, and an excellent one. Light and impossible to sink, which serves for pleasure or fishing. But when you wish to embark in it, you must surely go up to the surface of the sea. By no means. This boat is fastened to the upper part of the hull of the Nautilus and rests in a cavity prepared for it. Its decks absolutely staunch and kept secured by solid bolts. This ladder leads to a manhole in the hull of the Nautilus, which corresponds to another hole in the side of the launch. It is through these openings that I enter the boat. In shutting one, I open the other, by pressure of a screw. I pull out the bolts, and the boat rises with great swiftness to the surface. I then open the deck panel, hitherto carefully closed. I step the mast, hoist my sail, or take to the oars, and pull about. But how do you return to the boat? I do not return. It is the Nautilus which comes up. At your order? Yes. An electric cord is extended between us. I merely send a telegram, and that is sufficient. In fact, said I, intoxicated by these wonders, nothing can be more easy. Having passed the staircase leading to the platforms, I saw a cabin in which Conseil and Ned Land had enjoyed an excellent meal. Thence a door opened into a kitchen situated between the immense storerooms. There the electricity, more energetic and more obedient than gas, did all the cooking. The wires, passing into the fireplaces, communicated to the platinum sponges a heat which was evenly maintained. It equally heated the distilling apparatus, by which vaporization made a very drinkable water. From the kitchen opened a bathroom, comfortably arranged, and with hot and cold water laid on. Beyond the kitchen was the sailor's cabin, but the door was closed, and I was not able to inspect its arrangements, which might have given me some idea of the number of men required to navigate the Nautilus. At the end another bulkhead separated this cabin from the engine room. The doors opened, and I found myself in the compartment in which Captain Nemo, a most accomplished engineer, had arranged the machinery. This engine room, well lighted, was of great extent. It was properly divided into two parts, one for the elements which produced the electricity, the other for the mechanism which moved the screw. I was at first surprised by the smell, sui generis, which pervaded the room. Captain Nemo noticed my impressions. It is only an escape of gas produced by the use of the sodium, but it is not very unpleasant. Moreover, every morning we purify and ventilate the ship thoroughly. But now I began to examine with a lively interest the engine of the Nautilus. "You perceive," said the captain, "that I employ the Bunsen elements in preference to the Ruhmkorff," which did not answer. The Bunsen elements are fewer but stronger, as experience has shown. The electricity produced goes to the stern of the vessel, where it acts by means of electromagnets of great power upon a particular system of levers and gearing, which transmit the motion to the shaft of the screw. Thus a diameter of 6 meters and a pitch of 7½ can give me 120 revolutions in a second. And you obtain from that a speed of 50 miles an hour. There was some mystery here, but I did not insist upon an explanation. How could electricity yield such a force? Where did this illimitable force take its origin? Was it in the excessive tension obtained by a novel kind of bobbins? Was there in its transmission through the system of levers the power to increase it indefinitely? That was what I could not understand. "Captain Nemo," said I see the result, but I do not seek the explanation of the means. I have seen the Nautilus maneuver before the Abraham Lincoln, and I know its speed. But speed is not everything. You must be able to see whither you are going. You must have the power to direct your course to the right or left, up or down. How do you reach the deeps, where you must support a pressure of hundreds of atmospheres? How do you rise to the surface of the ocean? Finally, how do you maintain your vessel halfway when it suits you to do so? Am I indiscreet in asking all these questions?" "Not at all," replied the captain after a little hesitation. "Since you are never likely to quit this submarine vessel, come into the saloon. It is our study, and there you shall be made acquainted with all you ought to know respecting the Nautilus." Chapter 13, and probably my last chapter for this. A few figures. We were soon seated in the saloon, enjoying our cigars. The captain placed a diagram in my hands, showing the sections and elevations of the Nautilus. He then commenced his description as follows. You perceive, Monsieur Aronnax, that my boat is an elongated cylinder, pointed at the extremities. It is of much the same shape as a cigar, a form which has already been tried in England and several vessels. Its length is exactly 70 yards, its greatest breadth 10 yards. It is not, you see, constructed exactly on the principle of your swift-going steamers, but its lines are sufficiently lengthened to permit the displacement of water to pass away easily and to oppose no serious resistance to its progress. The above measurement will enable you to arrive at the displacement and weight of the Nautilus. Its surface measures a lot of square kilometers, its volume also a lot of meters. So when completely immersed, it displaces or weighs 1,500 cubic meters, or tons. When I planned this vessel for submarine navigation, I intended that 9/10 should be immersed and 1/10 out of the water. Consequently, it would not displace more than 9/10 of its volume, that is to say, a lot of square meters, or the same number of tons. I was therefore obliged not to exceed that weight in constructing it according to the following dimensions. The Nautilus is composed of 2 hulls, one within the other, fastened by T-shaped bolts, which give the vessel great strength. In fact, it has as much resistance in this form as solid mass would possess. The bulwark cannot be broken. It adheres by itself and is not riveted. The homogeneity of its construction and the joining of the materials enables it to defy the most violent seas. The 2 hulls are made of iron plates, whose density with respect to the water is at some numbers. The first is not less than 2.5 inches thick and weighs 364 and some tons. The second skin includes the keel, 20 inches high and 10 thick, which weighs by itself 62 tons. The engine and ballast, the various accessories and gear, the compartments and supports of the interior weigh a lot of tons, which gives a total of many more tons. Is that clear? Perfectly, I replied. I apologise, I don't know how to read some of this notation. Well, continued the captain, when the Nautilus is in the sea, under these conditions, it emerges 1/10. Now I make the reservoirs of a capacity equal to this 10th, that is to say of 150 and some numbers tons, and fill them with water. The vessel will then be completely immerged. That is the case. These reservoirs exist in the lower part of the Nautilus. I open the tops, the reservoirs are filled, and the boat sinks to a level with the surface of the water. Very good, Captain, but now we have arrived at the real difficulty. I can understand that you can get level with the surface, but in going lower down in your submarine vessel, do you not encounter a pressure, and consequently endure a pressure from below, which may be estimated at an atmosphere for 30 feet of water, or about 15 pounds for every square inch? Quite so. Then unless you fill up the Nautilus altogether, I do not see how you can get her down to the bottom of the sea. Monsieur, replied Captain Nemo, you cannot confuse statics and dynamics without running the risk of grave errors. It gives me very little trouble to reach the depths of the ocean, for all bodies have a tendency to sink. Do you follow me? I am listening, Captain. When I wish to determine what increase of weight I must give the Nautilus to sink her, I have only to think of the reduction in the volume of seawater, according as we get lower and lower down. That is clear enough, I replied. Now if water be not absolutely incomprehensible, it is nearly so. In fact, according to the latest calculations, it is only 0.000436 per atmosphere for each 30 feet of depth. If I want to descend 1,000 yards, I calculate the reduction of volume of a column of water of 1,000 yards, that is to say, under the pressure of 100 atmospheres. This reduction will then be 436 hundred millionths. I must then increase the weight so as to sink to a great many tons, instead of slightly lesser tons. The increase will consequently only be 6 and some tons. Is that all? Yes, and the calculations can be easily verified, so I have supplementary reservoirs capable of holding 100 tons. So I can descend to a very considerable depth. When I wish to come up again to the surface, I have only to eject the water in all the reservoirs, and the Nautilus will float with 1/10 immerged. I could not object to these figures. "I admit your calculations, Captain," I replied, and it would be in very bad taste to dispute them, since the experience has proved them right every day. But I confess to a difficulty." "What is that?" "When you are at a depth of 1,000 yards, the sides of the Nautilus support a pressure of 100 atmospheres. So then, at the time you employ your reservoirs for the purpose of rising to the surface, you must overcome by means of your pumps this pressure of 100 atmospheres, which is 1,500 pounds for a square inch. Such a power electricity alone can give me," interrupted Captain Nemo. "I repeat that the dynamics of power of my engines is almost infinite. The pumps have enormous power. For instance, look at the columns of water thrown like a torrent upon the deck of the Abraham Lincoln. Besides, I do not fill my supplementary reservoirs except to reach moderate depths. But when the fancy seizes me to visit the very bottom of the sea, or 2 or 3 leagues below the surface, I employ other more complicated but not less certain measures." "What are they?" I inquired. "That naturally leads me to tell you how the Nautilus is worked. I am very anxious to know, I assure you. To steer her to larboard or starboard, to work her horizontally, in a word, I make use of an ordinary rudder with a large blade fixed behind the stern post, and which a wheel and tackling puts in motion. But I can also move the Nautilus up or down, vertically, by means of 2 inclined planes attached to her sides at the centre of flotation. These are movable and fitted to take any position, and which are worked from inside by powerful levers. These are kept parallel to the vessel when she is moving horizontally, but if inclined upwards or downwards, the Nautilus follows the same direction, and by the power of her screw plunges or rises at any angle I please. And even if I wish to return very rapidly to the surface, I ship the screw, and the pressure of the water sends the Nautilus vertically to the surface, as a balloon filled with hydrogen mounts into the air. One quick second." I just had to release a cat from his cage. His cage being this room. "Bravo, Captain," I cried. "But how can the steersman find the proper direction beneath the water?" "The helmsman is placed in a glazed compartment which opens upon the upper part of the vessel, which is fitted with lenticular glasses." "Glasses capable of resisting so great a pressure?" "Certainly. Crystal, though fragile to a blow, will resist considerable pressure. In fishing experiences by electric light in the North Sea in 1864, plates of this material, of only 1/3 of an inch in thickness, resisted a pressure of 16 atmospheres, to say nothing of the heated rays which divided the heat unequally. Now the glasses I make use of are not less than 21 centimetres thick in the centre, that is to say 30 times more than those." "Admitted," said I. "But to be able to see the light you must overcome the obscurity of the water. How is that accomplished?" "Behind the steersman a powerful electric light is placed, which lights up the sea for half a mile ahead." "Well done indeed, Captain. I can now comprehend the phosphorescence of the pretended narwhal, which has puzzled all the knowing ones. By the way, may I ask if the collision between the Nautilus and the Scotia was purely accidental?" "Entirely so. I was moving 2 yards under the water when the collision occurred. I saw that it had no unpleasant result." "None. But how about your meeting with the Abraham Lincoln?" "I am very sorry, monsieur, for one of the ships of the fine American Navy. But she attacked me, and I only defended myself. Moreover, I was content to let the frigate off easily. They will have no difficulty to repair her in the nearest port." "Ah!" I cried with an air of conviction, "there is no doubt that your Nautilus is a wonderful vessel." "Yes," replied Captain Nemo with emotion, "indeed she is, and I love her as my own child. If all is danger upon one of your vessels launched upon the ocean, if upon the sea the first impression is of the gulf beneath, as has been well said by Jansen, in the Nautilus a man has nothing to fear. No injury, for the double hull is as strong as iron can be, no inconvenience from rolling or pitching, no sails for the wind to carry away, no boilers to burst, no fire to fear, since the fittings are all iron. No coal to exhaust, because electricity is the motive power. No collisions need be feared, because we can traverse the very depths of the ocean. No storm to brave, because at a few yards beneath the surface all is still. So there, monsieur, there is the ship par excellence. And if it be true that the engineer has more confidence in the ship than the builder, and the builder more than the captain himself, you can understand how proud I am of my Nautilus, since I am constructor, engineer, and captain in my own person. He spoke with a persuasive eloquence. The flashing eye, the passionate gesture seemed to change him completely. Truly, he loved his ship as a parent his child. But another, perhaps an indiscreet question naturally presented itself, and I risked it. "You're an engineer, then, Captain Nemo?" "Yes," he replied. "I studied in London, Paris, and New York." "But how could you secretly construct such a vessel as the Nautilus?" "Each part, Monsieur Aronnax, reached me from a different part of the world, and under a false name. The keel was forged at Creusot, the screw shaft by Penn & Co., London. The iron plates were made by Laird of Liverpool. The screw was by Scott of Glasgow. The reservoirs were constructed by Cale & Co. in Paris. The engine by Krupp in Prussia. The spur in the workshop of Motala in Sweden. The instrument at Hart Brothers, New York, and each manufacturer received my plans under a different name. But when the parts were made, it was necessary to put them together. I established my workshops in a desert island in the open sea. There my workmen, that is to say the brave companions whom I have instructed and got together, and I built our Nautilus. When we had finished, we destroyed by fire every trace of our work. I would have destroyed the island had I been able. Then I may conclude that the price of the vessel was very great." "Monsieur Aronnax, a ship of iron costs 1,155 francs per ton. The Nautilus cost 1,500. That is therefore 1,687,000 francs cost. Allow 2 millions for the fittings, and 4 or 5 millions for the works of art and collections, and you have the total. A last question, Captain Nemo." "What is it?" "I suppose you are very rich?" "Infinitely wealthy, monsieur. I could, without inconvenience, pay the 10 milliards of the French debt." I looked steadily at this extraordinary individual as he spoke thus. Was he taking advantage of my credulity? The future will show. And that brings us to the end of the chapter, and the end of this reading for tonight. So, thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.